The needle slipped through calico the color of a Kansas sunset, and Eudora Bailey did not look up even when the bell above the door of her small shop announced a visitor, because she had learned long ago that looking up too quickly gave people the impression she was desperate for their company, and she was not desperate for anything anymore. That had been the first lesson she had taught herself in the town of Harlan Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, when she had arrived with $32 sewn into the hem of her skirt, a battered sewing box her mother had pressed into her hands on a railway platform in Missouri, and absolutely nothing else to her name. No husband, no father waiting to receive her, no family land deeded to anyone who shared her blood, just the needle, the thread, and a stubborn certainty that she would find a way to make something from the raw material of her own determination. She had been 24 years old then. She was 27 now, and the shop on Clement Street was entirely hers. The bell rang again, which meant the door was still open, which meant the visitor was still standing in the frame rather than stepping inside, which meant they were either deciding whether to come in or trying to let the warm June air follow them through. She finished her stitch, knotted it cleanly, and finally allowed herself to look up. He was tall in the way that men who had spent years on horseback tended to be tall, all length in the leg and breadth across the shoulder, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years spent working beneath a sky that had no interest in mercy. His hat was in his hands rather than on his head, which she noted immediately because it spoke of manners that he had chosen to exercise voluntarily. His boots were dusty. His coat was plain brown wool, worn at the elbows but clean. His eyes, when they found hers across the shop floor, were a color she could not immediately name, somewhere between hazel and green, the kind of color that changed depending on what light was falling across them. "I am looking for the seamstress," he said. His voice was low and deliberate, the kind of voice that did not waste words. "You found her," Eudora said, setting her work down on the cutting table and rising from her chair. "What can I do for you?" He stepped fully inside then, and she noticed that he moved carefully through the space, as if he were aware of how much room he occupied, and was making a conscious effort to take up only what was necessary. He looked at the bolts of fabric on the shelves, at the two dress forms wearing half-finished garments, at the glass case near the counter that displayed spools of thread arranged by color. "I need a shirt," he said, "two if you are willing. I have been wearing the same two since before I rode into the territory, and they are past saving." "I can see that," Eudora said, not unkindly. "Have you been measured recently?" "Not since I was 17 and my aunt insisted on it." He paused. "That was 11 years ago, and I have changed considerably since then." "I imagine you have." She moved to the counter and retrieved her measuring tape. "I will need your name for the order." "George Conroy," he said. "I have just taken on the foreman position at the Halstead Ranch, about 4 miles east of town. I expect I will be here for some time." "Eudora Bailey," she said, coming around the counter toward him. She held up the measuring tape. "May I?" "Please," he said, and there was something about the way he said it, genuinely courteous rather than performed, that registered somewhere in her chest without her permission. She measured him efficiently, the way she measured every customer, calling out numbers and recording them on a small card, keeping her focus entirely professional. Shoulders, chest, arm length, neck. She had done this hundreds of times, and it meant nothing more than arithmetic. But she noticed, in the way that a person cannot entirely prevent themselves from noticing, that he smelled like horses and clean air and something faintly like pine resin, and that when she reached up to measure his neck she had to rise onto her toes slightly, and he very slightly angled his chin downward without being asked, so that she could reach. "What fabric?" she asked, stepping back. "Something durable." "I am not concerned with elegance." She moved to the shelves and ran her fingers along the bolts until she reached the ones appropriate for working shirts. "This one," she said, pulling out a bolt of dark blue cotton, "is strong enough to survive daily ranch work and will not show dust the way a lighter color would. I have a similar weight in dark brown if you want a second option." He looked at both. "Both of those, one of each." I can have them ready in 5 days. That is fine. He reached into his jacket and produced a small leather coin purse. What do you need up front? Half is fine. She named the price, watched him count out the coins with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he did everything else, and received the payment. She wrote out a receipt and handed it to him. "Thank you, Miss Bailey," he said. He put his hat back on as he moved toward the door, settling it in place with a practiced motion. "It is Mrs. Bailey," she said, not because she wanted to correct him, but because she had learned that the correction made certain things simpler, though it has been some time since I have gone by it in practice. He paused at the door and turned back to look at her, and she could see him processing that information, deciding what to do with it, deciding whether to say anything. "I am sorry for whatever brought that to be," he said quietly, and then he went out, and the bell above the door rang once more as it swung shut behind him. Eudora stood in the middle of her shop for a moment, the measuring card in one hand and the coin in the other, and then she went back to her chair and picked up her needle and her calico, and told herself firmly that a polite cowboy with decent manners was nothing unusual in Kansas, and she should not read anything into a single exchange. She thought about the color of his eyes twice more before supper. The story of how Eudora Bailey had come to own a dress shop in Harlan Creek was not a story she told often, because it was not the kind of story that invited easy sympathy, and she had never been comfortable with the way people shifted when they were trying to figure out whether they felt more sorry for her or more impressed by her. But the broad outlines of it were known in town, the way most things were known in a town of 800 souls in 1878. She had arrived from Missouri, widowed young, with nothing. Her husband, a man named Thomas Bailey who had been 10 years her senior and not particularly careful with his own safety, had died of a fever in the winter of 1876, leaving her with 2 debts, a rented room, and the knowledge that she was entirely alone. She had sewn since she was old enough to hold a needle without stabbing herself, and she had sewn for money since she was 16, doing alterations and repairs from the back room of her family's farmhouse. When Thomas died, she had taken stock of what she had, which was the sewing box, the tools, the skill, and the $32 she had managed to save without his knowledge in the years of their marriage, because some part of her had always understood that a woman needed a reserve that no one else could touch. She had gotten on a train. She had ridden to the end of the line, which happened to be a junction near Harlan Creek. She had spent 3 weeks sleeping in the back room of the general store while she sewed alterations in exchange for the space, and then she had taken in enough commissions that she could rent the small building on Clement Street, and then she had worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. And then, after a year of that, she had paid the building's owner 3 months in advance and proposed a purchase price. And after some negotiation, he had accepted it. And then Eudora Bailey had owned a building and a business. She thought of it sometimes when she was working late, when the lamplight was warm and the thread moved through her fingers with a rhythm that felt like breathing. She had made this. She had assembled it from almost nothing, stitch by stitch, hour by hour, penny by penny, and it was entirely hers, and no one could take it from her. It was the thing she was most proud of in her life. It was also, if she was honest with herself in the private hours, the thing that had cost her the most in terms of ordinary living. She had no close friends in Harlan Creek, or rather she had friendly acquaintances, which was not the same thing. She had Mabel Trent from the Mercantile who waved at her every morning and sometimes brought her pie, and she had old Dr. Haskins who fixed her hands when they cramped from the cold, and she had the women who came to her for dresses and alterations who were pleasant enough and some of whom she genuinely liked. But she had built walls of competence and self-sufficiency so carefully and so thoroughly that most people had stopped trying to find the door in them. She was all right with that. She was all right. On the 3rd day after George Conroy's visit, the trouble started. It was a Tuesday, and she was in the middle of cutting the blue cotton for his first shirt when Harlan Creek's sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Walt Greer who had held the position for 6 years and performed it with a kind of blunt competence, came to her door with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she recognized as the precursor to difficult news. "Eudora," he said, "I need to speak with you about your building." She set down the shears. "Sit down, Walt." He sat in the customer chair across from her work table and turned his hat over in his hands. "You know Clarence Hooper has been buying up properties on this side of Clement Street." She did know. Clarence Hooper was a man who had arrived in Harlan Creek in 1876 with enough money to make himself relevant and enough ambition to make himself difficult. He had bought 3 buildings already and was, by all local observation, not finished. "I also know that I own this building," she said evenly. "The deed is registered at the county office in Millbridge. That is what I want to talk to you about." Walt looked at his hat rather than her face, which she took as a bad sign. "Hooper has filed a claim saying that the original owner of this building, a man named Renfrew, owed him a debt at the time of the sale to you, and that the sale was therefore not legitimate because it was made with the purpose of avoiding that debt." Eudora was very still for a moment. She was familiar with the feeling of the ground shifting under her feet. She had felt it when Thomas died. She had learned to stand steady when it happened. "That is not true," she said. "I believe you," Walt said. "But Hooper has a lawyer from Wichita coming to town to make the claim formal, and the county judge is not due in Harlan Creek until September, which means this sits unsettled for 3 months unless you can counter his claim with documentation of your own. I have my deed. You need more than that if he is making a claim about the circumstances of the original sale. You need evidence of Renfrew's good standing at the time he sold to you, or evidence that Hooper's debt claim is fabricated." He finally looked up at her. "Eudora, I am telling you because you deserve to know, and because I think Hooper is a greedy man who is using legal machinery to take things that aren't his, but my hands are tied until the judge comes." After Walt left, Eudora sat for a long time at her work table without moving. Then she picked up her shears and went back to cutting the blue cotton, because the shirt still needed to be made and George Conroy would be back in 5 days, and she was not going to let Clarence Hooper or his Wichita lawyer or the grinding machinery of financial predation stop her hands from moving. But inside, something cold had settled in her chest, and she could not entirely dislodge it. On the 5th day, as promised, George Conroy came back. She had both shirts finished and pressed, hanging from the rack near the front window, and when he came through the door she had the small sense of satisfaction she always felt when an order was complete and ready. He examined the shirts carefully, turning them over in his hands, checking the seams. "These are excellent work," he said, and the way he said it was not flattering in the way customers sometimes flattered, which was really just a form of courtesy. He said it like a man reporting a fact. "Thank you," she said. He counted out the remaining payment and she gave him the shirts wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He did not move toward the door immediately, which she noticed. "May I ask you something?" he said. "You may ask," she said. "I reserve the right not to answer." Something shifted in his expression and she thought it might have been the beginning of a smile. "Fair enough. I heard in town this morning that there may be a legal dispute over this building. I heard Hooper's name mentioned." "You have been in Harlan Creek less than a week," she said, "and you already know about Clarence Hooper." "A foreman learns to learn quickly," he said. "Men on the ranch talk. Hooper has tried to acquire Halstead land before. The Halsteads have resources to fight him. I gathered that not everyone does." She looked at him steadily. "Why do you ask?" "Because I wanted to know if it was true," he said, "and if there was anything that could be done." "Why would that be your concern?" He considered this for a moment, and she appreciated that he considered it rather than answering immediately, the way a man who had prepared a charming answer would. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "I only know that you made 2 good shirts, and you seem like someone who has worked hard for what she has, and I do not like to see a man like Hooper use money to undo honest work." Eudora watched him for a moment. Then she said, "I need documentation from Millbridge about Renfrew's standing when he sold me this building. I also need to find someone who knew Renfrew and can speak to whether he had any dealings with Hooper before 1877. The county seat is a full day's ride. I ride to Millbridge on Friday with supplies for the ranch, George said. I can make inquiries at the county clerk's office if you can tell me what to ask for. She opened her mouth to refuse because refusing was the reflex she had trained into herself, and then she shut it again because refusing would be foolish, and whatever else she was not a fool. I will write it down for you, she said. He waited while she wrote out the list on a sheet of paper in her clean, precise hand, and when she handed it to him he read it through, nodded, folded it, and put it in his jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said. It came out more quietly than she intended. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "I have not done anything yet." He came back on Saturday with 4 pages of documents from the Millbridge County Record's office, and the information that a man named Claude Renfrew had, in fact, been entirely free of debt to Clarence Hooper at the time of the sale to Eudora, because Hooper had only arrived in Harlan Creek 4 months after the sale had been completed. His debt claim was not just questionable, it was chronologically impossible. Eudora read the documents at her work table while George Conroy sat in the customer chair and drank the coffee she had made without quite deciding to make it. And when she finished reading, she looked up and he was watching her with that steady, unhurried attention of his that she was beginning to recognize as his habitual way of being in a room. "This destroys his claim," she said. "That is what I thought too." He paused. "There is a telegraph office in Millbridge. I sent a message to the county judge's clerk explaining the date discrepancy and asking whether the judge could expedite his review of the matter." "I hope that was not overstepping." She stared at him. "You sent a telegraph message." "I did, on my behalf." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" He turned his coffee cup around in his hands. "Because I could," he said. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I would have wanted someone to do the same if I were in that position." He looked up at her. "I am not trying to insert myself where I am not wanted, Mrs. Bailey. If you would rather handle this entirely on your own, I will step back. You can call me Eudora," she said, surprising herself. "Everyone does." "Eudora," he said, as if he were testing how it sounded, and something about hearing her own name in his voice did an entirely unauthorized thing to the space between her ribs. She poured more coffee for both of them, and they sat at opposite ends of the work table in the warm, late afternoon light. And she asked him about the Halstead Ranch, and he told her about it, about the cattle and the land, and the 2 years he had spent working the southern ranges before being offered the foreman position. And she told him about the route she had taken from Missouri, and the 3 weeks sleeping in the back of the general store. And he listened to that last part with an attention that was entirely without pity, but entirely full of something she had trouble naming until later, lying in her small bed above the shop, when she identified it as respect. Nobody except perhaps old Dr. Haskins had looked at her with quite that quality of respect before, and Dr. Haskins was 64 and had grandchildren. The judge sent his clerk's reply within the week. Hooper's claim was denied on the grounds of chronological impossibility. The building remained unambiguously hers. Walt Greer brought her the news on a Wednesday afternoon with a smile on his face that was the most genuine expression she had ever seen from him. And Eudora stood in the middle of her shop and breathed the way a person breathes when they have been holding their breath for longer than they realized, deep and full. She went to the Halstead Ranch that evening. She had never been to a cattle ranch before, or rather she had sewn for ranchers' wives but never gone to the place itself. And as she drove her small borrowed wagon along the eastern road, she was aware of how strange it felt to be going somewhere without a specific professional reason. She had made a pecan cake, which she told herself was simply polite and not in any way significant, and she had changed her dress, which she told herself was simply practical because her working dress had flour on it from the cake. The ranch was larger than she had imagined. A collection of sturdy buildings spread across a flat stretch of land with the flat Kansas horizon stretching out behind it in every direction. The sky enormous and the light going gold with the evening. A few hands were visible in the yard and near the barn, and one of them pointed her toward the bunkhouse office when she asked for George Conroy. She found him at a small desk near the window, working on papers by lamplight, his coat hanging on a hook and his sleeves rolled to the elbow in the evening warmth. He looked up when she knocked on the open door, and something happened in his expression that was too quick for her to fully read, some kind of lighting up that went as quickly as it came. "Eudora," he said, rising immediately. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is better than all right," she said. "Hooper's claim was denied. The judge's office confirmed it today." She held up the cake, which suddenly felt more transparent than she had intended. "I made this." He looked at the cake and then at her face, and he was doing that thing with his expression where it almost became a smile without fully committing. "You drove 4 miles to bring me a cake." "I drove 4 miles to bring you news," she said, "and the cake happened to be ready." "I see." He pulled the other chair around and they sat in the small office, and he found 2 tin cups and they ate cake from them, which was not ideal but was entirely fine. And outside the Kansas evening settled into indigo, and the cattle made their distant sounds and there were crickets, and Eudora thought that she had not felt this particular quality of ease with another human being in a very long time. He told her more about himself that evening, not performing it, just telling it the way you tell things to someone who has shown genuine interest. He was 29, from a small town in Ohio originally, the second of 4 siblings, had come west at 19 because the land in Ohio was already divided, and there was nothing in it that called to him the way the open country had called, through stories, and through the particular restlessness that sometimes settled in young men like a stone in a boot. He had worked cattle for 10 years. He had been engaged once at 23 to a woman in Colorado who had ultimately decided that a man with no land and no fixed prospects was not the life she wanted, and she had not been wrong to decide that, he said, without bitterness, which she noticed. Made the right choice for herself, he said. "I hold no grudge. A woman ought to be able to choose her life." Eudora looked at him. "That is a somewhat unusual position for a man in 1878. "I suppose it is," he said. "But I grew up watching my mother make the best of choices that were not entirely hers to make, and I thought even then that it was not right." He paused. "Though I recognize that thinking something is not right and being in a position to change it are very different matters." "They are," she said. She thought of things she could say about what it had felt like to arrive in Harlan Creek with $32 and no one in the world who felt any particular obligation toward her. But she did not say them, not yet, because some things required more time to say. She drove back to town in the dark with the lamp on the wagon casting a small circle of light, and the stars were extraordinary, the way they always were out here where there was nothing to diminish them, and she was aware that she was smiling without having decided to smile. She told herself it was only because of the building. It was only relief. She did not entirely believe herself, but it was a comfortable fiction for the space of the drive, so she allowed it. July came to Harlan Creek with heat that settled over the town like a wool blanket and did not lift until well after sundown each day. Eudora's shop was warmest in the afternoons, when the western sun came through the front window, and she had taken to opening the back door to create a cross breeze that helped enough to make working bearable. She was busy, as she was always busy in summer, because women wanted lightweight dresses for the heat, and also because there was a dance being planned for the 4th of July celebration, which meant a run on new dresses and repaired gloves and altered bodices. George came to the shop twice during the first week of July, and she was not keeping count, except that she was. The first time was because one of the shirts had developed a problem with the buttonholes after a difficult day of work, which she repaired at no charge and returned to him in less than an hour. The second time he came with no stated reason at all, which registered as significant and which she chose not to examine too closely. He sat in the customer chair and drank coffee and watched her work, and they talked about the ranch and the town and the nature of Kansas weather, and a book she was reading and a newspaper article he had found interesting. And it was entirely ordinary and also entirely not. And she found herself listening for the bell above the door in the mornings in a way she had not listened for anything in a long time. Mabel Trent from the Mercantile noticed, because Mabel Trent noticed everything. "That is the Halstead foreman who keeps coming by," Mabel said one morning, not quite posing it as a question, while she stood at the counter waiting for a hem Eudora was finishing. "He orders shirts from me," Eudora said. "He ordered shirts once," Mabel said. "The last 3 visits do not appear to have involved shirts." "He is pleasant company," Eudora said. Mabel's expression was warm and knowing and not unkind. "He is very nice-looking company." "Mabel, I am simply observing." "Please continue not observing it to anyone else," Eudora said, handing her the finished hem. Mabel laughed, took the dress, and left with an expression that suggested she would absolutely continue observing it, just quietly. The 4th of July dance was held in the meeting hall, which was the largest building in Harlan Creek, and which the town used for everything from church suppers to elections to the occasional trial that did not require formal court proceedings. Eudora attended because it would have been conspicuous not to attend, and because she had made 4 of the dresses currently hanging in the room and had a professional interest in seeing them in motion. She wore her own dark green dress that she had made the previous autumn, which she had never found a proper occasion for until now, and she wore her hair up with 2 small combs that had belonged to her mother. She was standing near the refreshment table talking to Lucy Halstead, the rancher's wife, a cheerful and direct woman of 45 who managed the household and her husband with equal competence, when George appeared at her elbow. He was wearing a good dark coat over a white shirt she did not recognize, which meant it had come from somewhere else, and he had made an effort with his appearance that was visible without being overdone. "Mrs. Halstead," he said, nodding to his employer's wife. Then to Eudora, "You look very fine this evening." "Thank you," she said. She was proud of herself for saying it without deflecting, without minimizing it the way she had once minimized compliments as a reflex. Lucy Halstead excused herself with a small smile that said exactly what she was thinking, and then it was just the 2 of them in the lamplight and the music. "Will you dance?" he asked. She had not danced since before Thomas died, which was 7 years ago. She was aware of this. She was aware that dancing was simple and meant nothing, and also that it meant standing close to someone with their hand at your waist, which was not nothing at all. "Yes," she said. He was a competent dancer, not flashy, not trying to lead her through anything she might not know, simply moving through the steps with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything. His hand at her waist was steady and warm and entirely appropriate, and she was aware of the whole length of the space between them, which was proper and also felt, in some way she could not articulate, like a conversation. They danced twice, and then they stood at the edge of the floor and watched other people dance and talked about the town and the evening, and then they danced a 3rd time, and by the 3rd time she was no longer aware of the room in the way she had been, only of the music and his hand and his voice near her ear telling her something about a ridiculous incident with a steer that had gotten into the ranch kitchen, and she was laughing, genuinely laughing, which was a sound she had half forgotten she made. When the evening ended and the crowd filtered out into the warm summer night, he walked her to her door. This was, she recognized, a deliberate act. The door was 50 yards from the meeting hall. He could have said good night at the meeting hall. He chose not to. They stood at the door, and the night was warm and full of stars and cricket song, and she had her key in her hand and he had his hat in his hands again, and there was a moment where everything was very still. "Eudora," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if you are willing, not for shirts." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her without flinching, which she appreciated, because it meant he understood that this was a serious question, and he was willing to wait for a serious answer. "I should tell you some things first," she said, "about what I want from my life, about what I am not willing to give up." "Then tell me," he said simply. "Not tonight," she said, But soon, come to the shop on Thursday. Thursday, he said. Yes. She went inside. She stood in the dark of the front room and listened to his footsteps move away down the street, and she put her hand flat against the door she had locked behind herself and acknowledged, for the first time without qualification, that she was feeling something she had not felt in 7 years, and that it frightened her considerably, and that she was not, this time, going to let the fright make the decision for her. He came on Thursday. She had spent 2 days thinking about what she wanted to say, not composing a speech, just identifying the true things. She brewed coffee and let him sit down, and then she sat across from him at the work table and looked at him steadily. I need you to understand what this building is, she said, and what the business is. They are not incidental to my life. They are not something I have been doing while I wait for something else. This is my life. I built it. It is mine. I am not willing to have anyone's name or anyone's authority supersede that. I understand, he said. I am not sure you do fully, she said. I am saying that if I were ever to consider a future with a person, I would need that person to comprehend truly that my independence is not a phase or a compensation for loneliness. It is a thing I chose and built, and I am proud of. George was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, looking at it, and she could see him taking the words seriously rather than waiting for her to finish so he could reassure her. I think, he said slowly, that I first noticed you as a person worth knowing when I came in for shirts, and you did not look up immediately. And then when you did look up, you had the expression of someone who had decided their own worth quite clearly and was not interested in revising that assessment based on my opinion. He looked up at her. That was not a problem I wanted to solve. It was something I found I respected enormously. I am not asking you to hand me anything you built. I am asking whether I might be allowed to build something alongside it, with you, with your direction as to how. Eudora looked at him for a very long time. Outside, the street made its ordinary sounds, a horse going past, voices at the mercantile down the block, the distant sound of the blacksmith's work. That is a good answer, she said finally. Is it a sufficient one? It might be, she said. We should probably determine that over time. He smiled then fully. For the first time she had seen it happen completely rather than at the edge, and it changed his face entirely, made it younger and warmer and considerably more alarming to her equilibrium. I agree entirely, he said. Over time. The summer unfolded the way summers do in Kansas, with the heat and the thunderstorms and the particular brilliance of afternoons when the light was golden and horizontal, and made everything it touched seem significant. George came to the shop twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and they talked about everything and nothing, and he began helping her with small things. The hinges on the back door that had been stiff since winter, the shelf she needed at a height she could not reach without a step stool, the wagon wheel that had developed a wobble she had been meaning to address for a month. He did these things without fanfare, not as performance but as practical helpfulness, and he always asked before he did anything rather than simply doing it, which she noticed and valued more than she could easily express. They walked together on Sunday evenings when his work schedule allowed it, along the edge of town where the road opened into the plain, and the sky was enormous, and the air smelled like dry grass, and the particular clean smell of open country that she had come to love in 3 years of Kansas living. He talked about his family in Ohio, about the younger brothers he wrote letters to, about the sister who had married a farmer and seemed genuinely content. She talked about Missouri, about her mother who had died the year before Thomas, about the seamstress who had taught her the finer points of construction, and who had been the closest thing to a mentor she had ever had. In August, he took her to see the upper ranges of the Halstead land on horseback, which required her to borrow a horse from the livery stable and demonstrate that she could, in fact, ride, which she could, though it had been years. He rode beside her and pointed out landmarks, a cottonwood stand that marked a seasonal creek, a particular ridge where the prairie grass grew differently, and you could see it from a mile away as a slightly different shade of gold. He talked about the land with the same focused affection with which he talked about most things he cared about, without excess, but with a quality of attention that communicated genuine feeling. At the top of the ridge, with the flat country laid out below them in every direction and the horizon so far away that it curved, she sat on her borrowed horse and felt the wind and was very aware of him beside her, the solidity of his presence, the patience of it. "You love it out here," she said. "I do," he said. "I have been trying to understand why for 10 years. I think it is something about the scale. It reminds you of the correct proportion of things." "What do you mean?" "When you are surrounded by this much space," he said, "the things you are afraid of tend to look more accurately sized." He glanced at her. "The fears that seemed very large in a small room look smaller out here." She thought about that for a moment, the particular quality of it. "That is either very wise or very convenient," she said. He laughed, which was a warm sound. "Possibly both." September arrived, and with it a letter from Clarence Hooper's Wichita lawyer that surprised her not because of its content, which was a final legal acknowledgment of the dismissed claim, but because Hooper himself appeared at the shop 3 days later with an expression on his face that was trying to be conciliatory and not quite succeeding. He was a man of about 50, broad, with the look of someone who had been handsome once and was still operating on the capital of it. He had no legal standing left regarding her building, and they both knew it, but he stood across her counter with a practiced smile and made an offer to purchase the building outright for what was admittedly a generous price, framing it as an opportunity rather than a final attempt at acquisition. Eudora looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Hooper," she said, "this building is not for sale. I expect it will not be for sale in the future either. I would be grateful if you would stop spending legal and personal resources on attempts to acquire it, because it is wearing on my patience and I have a great deal of work to do." He left without the smile he had come in with. When she told George about it that evening, sitting on the small bench outside the shop in the September cool, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Good." "Just good," she said. "I had more elaborate things I was prepared to say," he admitted, "about the appropriate way to respond to that kind of predatory behavior, but you handled it so cleanly that none of it seemed necessary." He looked at her. "You are very capable of handling your own affairs." "I know," she said. "I have been telling you that." "You have," he said. "I believe you entirely." He was quiet for a moment. "It does not stop me from wanting to be present for them." The air between them was very still. The street was quiet in the September evening, lamplight from the Mercantile across the way casting long shadows. "I know that too," she said quietly. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the thing that had been building between them since the first day he walked through her door with his hat in his hands was present and plain, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. "Eudora," he said, the way he said her name when he was being most deliberately careful with it. "I find that I am not capable of spending time with you without wanting considerably more time with you. I am aware that this is something you have given a great deal of thought to. I am not asking you to decide anything tonight." He paused. "I only wanted to say it plainly." She looked at the lamplight on the street. She thought about the $32 and the sewing box and the 3 weeks in the back of the general store and every early morning and late night and difficult customer and the needle moving through fabric, hour after hour, building something from almost nothing. She thought about the color of his eyes in the morning light when he came through the door, and the way he said her name, and the way he had ridden to Millbridge on her behalf without being asked, and the way he had listened to her, genuinely listened, that first evening with the coffee and the cake in the bunkhouse office. She thought about the ridge where the plane went out in every direction, and he had said that the things you feared looked more accurately sized out there. "I have been alone for 3 years," she said slowly. "Not unhappily alone, not as a failure of some kind. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "And in those 3 years I have built something real," she said, "something that is mine." "I know that too," he said. "I would not want to change it." She turned to look at him fully. "Then say what you mean by more time." He met her eyes and did not look away. "I mean I want to know you for the rest of my life," he said. "I mean I want to be in the same place you are. I mean I want to add my thread to what you have built alongside yours, not over it." He paused. "I mean that I have not felt this way about a person before, and I am 30 years old and I am not confused about it." Eudora breathed slowly. The night was cool and smelled like autumn coming, the dry, sweet smell of the Kansas grass going dormant. Inside her chest, the thing she had been protecting with walls and competence and carefully maintained self-sufficiency was doing something she could not quite stop, some loosening that was not collapse but was instead the feeling of a tightly held breath finally being let go. "I need time," she said, "not because I am uncertain about my feelings, but because this is significant to me and I need to be certain I am making a decision clearly." "Take all the time you need," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She believed him, which was itself a thing of note. October was the most beautiful month in Kansas. The grass gone gold and the sky a shade of blue that had no equal in any other season. And Eudora was aware of the beauty with a particular intensity that seemed connected to the state of her inner weather. She worked and she walked and she thought, and she watched George be himself across the months of their growing acquaintance, steady and honest and occasionally funny in a dry, quiet way that caught her off guard, and kind to the people on the ranch and in the town without performing the kindness. She watched him navigate a dispute between two ranch hands that could have turned ugly, doing it with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, and the dispute resolved without violence or permanent damage to anyone's dignity. She watched him help an old man who had dropped his groceries in the street, without comment, without making it into a moment. She watched him listen to her, really listen, not in the way of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but in the way of a man who found the thoughts of the person in front of him genuinely interesting. And she watched herself, which was the more important work. She watched what happened when he was in the room, what happened when he was not, what happened when she imagined saying yes. There was fear there, and she looked at it clearly, which was the only way to look at fear if you intended to be honest with yourself about it. The fear was real and had its roots in real things. Thomas's death and the helplessness that had followed it, the years of managing alone, the thing that had grown in her that was proud and right but also, perhaps, somewhat armored. She thought about what George had said on the ridge, about fears looking more accurately sized in large open spaces. She thought about the fact that choosing to trust someone was not the same as becoming dependent on them. She thought about the difference between letting someone into your life and handing your life over to them. She thought about George's hands on the shelves he had fixed and the hinges he had adjusted, always asking first, always deferring to her judgment about where and how much. She thought about the fact that she was 27 years old and that she loved him. She had not admitted it even internally until that particular morning, a Wednesday in October with frost on the glass of her shop window and the smell of wood smoke from the neighboring chimneys. But when she finally admitted it, sitting at her work table with a half-finished bodice in her hands, it was entirely without drama, as if the admission had been waiting patiently for her to turn and acknowledge it. She loved him. The steady, quiet, competent, kind, genuinely interested and interesting man who had walked through her door with his hat in his hands and treated her work as the serious thing it was, and who had said he wanted to add his thread to what she had built. She loved him, and she had looked at the fear, and the fear was present and real, but it was, seen clearly, proportionate and manageable. She finished the bodice and set it aside and put on her coat and walked 4 miles in the October morning to the Halstead Ranch. She found him in the yard near the barn, working with a length of rope and one of the hands, something practical that she did not know the specific name of. He saw her coming, and his face did that thing again, the lighting up that came and went quickly but which she had learned to catch in the fraction of a second it occupied. He handed the rope to the other hand and came toward her, and his expression was open and asking without actually asking. She stopped in front of him. "Yes," she said. He was very still for a moment. The wind moved across the yard with a sound like breathing. "Yes," he said, making sure. "Yes," she said. "To more time, to alongside, to the thread you mentioned." She looked at him clearly. "I love you, George Conroy, and I have looked at that fact from every possible angle for 2 months, and it remains true from all of them." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he did something she did not expect. He laughed, softly, not at her but with something, with relief or joy or both, and then he reached out and took her hand carefully, the way he did everything, and held it in both of his. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately the third minute I was in your shop, and I have spent 5 months trying to give you adequate space to come to your own conclusions, and I want to tell you that it was the most difficult exercise in patience I have ever undertaken." She laughed then too, and the sound of it was carried away by the October wind, and overhead the sky was the deep October blue and the grass went gold to the horizon. "You did well," she said. "You are worth the effort," he said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, and she felt it all the way through to the center of herself. They were married in December. It was a small ceremony, as Eudora had insisted, at the Harlan Creek Church with the Halsteads as witnesses and Mabel Trent crying happily in the first row, and old Dr. Haskins looking pleased in a grandfatherly way. She wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with small blue flowers at the collar that she had embroidered herself over 3 evenings, and she carried dried lavender because that was what was available in December in Kansas, and she had always liked lavender. George wore his good coat and a new shirt she had made him, dark blue, the nicest work she had done in a long time, and he stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his own good fortune, which was an expression Eudora found she had no objection to. When the minister said the words she had already turned over in her mind many times, thinking about what they meant in the context of the life she had built, she found that they did not feel like a surrender. They felt like an agreement between equals, which was what she had needed them to feel like. When it was done and the church doors opened onto the December afternoon, they went out together into the cold, bright air, and George put her hand through his arm, and she leaned into him slightly, and it felt entirely natural. They had decided, after considerable practical discussion over several weeks, to live in the rooms above the shop. George had proposed and she had proposed, and they had gone back and forth in the way of two people who both had sensible ideas and were genuinely trying to make the best arrangement. The ranch work kept him occupied during the days, and she had her shop, and the rooms above it were more than adequate for 2 people, and it was, as she had pointed out, her building, which she was not leaving. "It seems obvious," George had said, entirely agreeing. "I would not ask you to leave what you built." He moved his few possessions from the bunkhouse to the rooms above the shop on the day after the wedding, and she watched him settle into the space with that characteristic unhurried competence, finding places for things, adapting without complaint to a space he had not designed for himself. He did not rearrange anything of hers without asking. He did not presume. He asked where things should go and accepted her answers, and over the course of a week they arrived at an arrangement that felt, surprisingly quickly, like both of theirs. The winter evenings became the texture of her days in a way she had not anticipated. She had grown accustomed to the quiet evenings in the rooms above the shop, the solitary reading and the mending she did for herself, and the sound of the town outside the window. Now there were 2 of them, and it was different, but not in the diminishing way she had vaguely feared. It was different in the way of a room with more light in it, warmer and brighter without being overwhelming. He read too, which she had not known, and they read in the same room by the fire in the evenings, and sometimes shared passages that struck them, and sometimes talked about what they were reading, and sometimes sat in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who do not need to fill space to feel connected. She loved him in the winter evenings. She loved him in the cold mornings when he made the fire before she woke up, not as a performance but simply because he woke earlier, and it was the practical thing to do. She loved him when he came back from the ranch in the late afternoon smelling of cold air and horses, and brought her news from the wider world she did not always have access to while she worked. She loved him in the way she had not allowed herself to love Thomas, openly and with the full weight of herself, without reservation, and it felt nothing like the risk she had feared. It felt like the thing she had been most in need of without knowing it. January brought a heavy snowfall that shut Harlan Creek down for 3 days, and those 3 days were something she would remember for the rest of her life. The shop closed, and the streets white and quiet, and the two of them upstairs by the fire, talking and reading and cooking together with a comfortable ease that felt like it had been established over years rather than weeks. He told her about his family, more of it, the small stories that did not come out in ordinary conversation. She told him about Missouri in more depth than she had told anyone, about what it had been like after her mother died and Thomas was sick, and she had understood that she might be entirely alone in the world. "I remember looking at my sewing box," she said, "and thinking that it was the most reliable thing I owned, because it was skill rather than circumstance. No one could take the skill away." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I am glad you had it," he said. "So am I," she said. He reached across and took her hand where it lay on the quilt between them, and she turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his, and outside the snow came down in the December silence. Spring came to Harlan Creek with the particular exuberance of Kansas springs, which were not gentle but were dramatic and decisive. The grass turning green over the course of what seemed like days, and the birds returning, and the air changing from the dry cold of winter to something softer that carried the smell of thawing earth. Eudora's shop was busy, as it always was in the spring, the annual renewal of wardrobes, and the new commissions from women who had spent the winter dreaming of lighter colors. She was also, she realized in March, expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days before she told George, not from any desire to conceal it, but because she needed those 3 days to orient herself to the new shape of things, to understand how she felt about it before she had to talk about it with anyone else. She had thought, abstractly, about children in connection with this marriage, had thought about the possibility without landing on a firm feeling. Now the possibility was a fact, and she took 3 days to sit with it and discover what she felt. What she felt, she found, was a large and somewhat overwhelming gladness. She told him on a Friday evening after supper directly the way she did things. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet when something was significant, taking it seriously rather than rushing to respond. And then he looked at her with an expression she had no words for, something that was love and wonder and the particular gravity of something real and permanent settling into place. "Are you well?" he said, the first thing. "I am very well," she said. "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "A little," he said. "Also rather overwhelmed with being glad?" "Yes," she said, "that." He came to her, and she put her arms around him, and he held her carefully, the way he did everything, and she rested her forehead against his shoulder, and the fire was warm, and outside the spring evening was dark and full of new sounds. Summer arrived, and with it the fullness of her pregnancy, and the particular physical reality of expecting a child in Kansas in July, which involved heat and the difficulty of work that had been manageable when she was not carrying additional weight in her midsection. She altered her working pattern, bringing in a young woman named Clara Hobbs who had shown aptitude for sewing and who needed the work, and training her to handle the simpler commissions while Eudora managed the more complex work in the business herself. George watched this adaptation with admiration, which he expressed without excess. "You are reorganizing the shop," he said one evening. "I am ensuring that the shop continues to function," she said. "I am not going to let it falter because of a temporary physical condition." "Of course not," he said. "You are not going to argue with me about working." "I would not dream of it," he said. "You know your own body and your own limits. My only request is that you tell me if you need anything." "I will," she said. "Good," he said. She looked at him, this man she had married, this steady and sensible and quietly loving man who had never once tried to manage her, and felt the same loose, warm feeling in her chest that his presence had reliably produced since approximately that third minute in the shop. The child was born in August. It was a boy, which George received with the same quality of overwhelmed gladness he had produced at the initial news of the pregnancy, and which Eudora received with her own form of the same. They named him James, after George's father, with the middle name Reuben after Eudora's father, which George had proposed without prompting when she mentioned her father's name in passing, and which had made something in her chest tighten with love. James Bailey Conroy arrived in the world with a strong pair of lungs and his father's hazel-green eyes and no hair to speak of, and he was the most extraordinary thing Eudora had ever seen, which surprised her only in the intensity of it because she had expected to love her child, but had not fully anticipated the dimensions of it. Clara Hobbs ran the shop for 3 weeks while Eudora recovered and oriented herself to motherhood, and at the end of 3 weeks, Eudora was back at her work table with James in a small basket on the floor nearby, sleeping with the boneless completeness of new infants. George rode to the ranch each morning and returned in the afternoon, and in the evenings held his son with the careful attention he brought to everything he valued. They fell into the rhythm of their new life with the same practical competence they had brought to the earlier stages, making adjustments, communicating about what was working and what needed revision, dividing the labor of the household and the child in ways that were not perfectly symmetrical but were genuinely shared. They argued sometimes, the way two people with strong and honest natures will argue, about practical decisions, about priorities, about the money for a second sewing machine that Eudora wanted and George thought could wait 6 months and she thought could not. They argued and resolved it and went forward, which was the function of argument between people who respected each other. James grew with the speed that babies grow, which is to say at a rate that seems simultaneously glacial in individual days and vertiginous when looked at across months. He was walking by the following summer, an unsteady careening walk that delighted everyone in the shop, and talking by the autumn of that year in the decisive single-word fashion of small children who have determined what they want and need only one word to convey it. The shop on Clement Street grew also. Clara Hobbs proved to be genuinely talented and reliable, and Eudora brought her on permanently and paid her a fair wage, which she had determined by asking Walt Greer what the men at the bank were paid for comparable hours and adjusting accordingly. She expanded the range of work she took on, and her reputation, which had been good before, became excellent, and women came from the next 3 towns for dresses and special occasion work. George was made a partner in the Halstead operation in the 2nd year of their marriage, which was a significant development both financially and in terms of his daily work, adding responsibility that he took seriously and handled with the competence that had made him valuable to the Halsteads from the start. It meant he was home less regularly in the evenings during the busy seasons, which they had talked about before it happened, planning for it, and Eudora did not resent the work because she understood the work because her own work required the same kind of total investment, and he had never once implied otherwise. Clarence Hooper left Harlan Creek in the spring of 1880, which was information Eudora received from Mabel Trent with a small sense of settled justice. He had overextended his acquisitions, and the bank in Wichita had called his debts, and he had sold what he could and gone, destination unknown. The 3 buildings he had owned on Clement Street went to a merchant from Abilene who had plans to open a dry goods operation and a hardware store, and the street was the better for the chain. "He is gone," Mabel told her over the counter of the mercantile. "I know," Eudora said. "I saw the wagon. You do not seem particularly triumphant." "I am," Eudora said, "but quietly, the way I prefer." Mabel laughed and gave her an extra scoop of coffee beans without charging for them, which was her way of marking occasions. When Eudora told George that evening, he said, "Good riddance," with a finality that she found deeply satisfying, and then they did not discuss it further because there was no more to discuss. Some things, once resolved, required no more words, and this was one of them. James turned 2 in August and was, by universal consensus in Harlan Creek, a cheerful and curious and absurdly charming small person who had inherited his father's steady quality and his mother's will, which combined in him into a sort of tranquil determination that made the adults around him smile. He followed Eudora around the shop on the days she brought him in, touching things carefully and asking the names of them, and she told him the names and watched him store them with the focused attention of a child who took the world seriously. George came home one afternoon in September to find them both at the work table, James on a stool beside Eudora with a piece of fabric and a blunt needle that she had threaded for him, making the large looping stitches of a child who has just been taught the basic motion. She was working on a commission beside him, glancing over periodically to watch him work, and the two of them were having a conversation in the unhurried way of a mother and a small child, questions and answers and the occasional observation. George stood in the doorway for a moment, in the late afternoon September light, and looked at them, and Eudora happened to glance up and see him standing there, and whatever was in his face made something ache in her chest in the best possible way. "You are staring," she said. "I am," he said. "I am exercising my right to stare at things that are very good." James looked up from his fabric. "Papa," he said, with the decisive satisfaction of a child stating a fact. "Yes," George said, coming in and picking him up and kissing his head. "That is me." That autumn Eudora discovered she was expecting again. The second pregnancy was easier than the first in some ways and harder in others. The ways that any second is different from the first when you have the experience to know what to expect, but also the additional demands of an existing child and a growing business. She adapted, and Clara Hobbs adapted with her, and George adapted without complaint or drama, quietly absorbing whatever additional domestic work was needed, and doing it without presenting it as sacrifice. "You do not have to do that," she said one evening, watching him prepare supper with James underfoot, which was an operation requiring considerable patient navigation. "I know," he said. "I want to. You are tired." "So are you," he said. "And you have been working all day and you are carrying our child. Let me make the supper." He looked at her. "Please sit down." She sat down, because she was tired, and because he was right, and because she had long since learned that accepting help from George Conroy was not the same as ceding something fundamental. It was simply receiving something offered by someone who loved her, which was its own category of thing. The second child was born in April, a boy they named Henry after no particular person, but because they both liked it, Henry Thomas Conroy, the Thomas for her first husband in a way that felt right to her, and which George had agreed to without hesitation, because he understood that a life contained its whole history, and that honoring the past did not diminish the present. Henry arrived with even more determination and volume than James had, and the sound of him in the shop building made Clara Hobbs laugh and say he was going to be an interesting person, which turned out to be accurate. James received his brother with a 2-year-old's mixture of fascination and territorial wariness, which Eudora navigated with the same practical directness she brought to all difficult situations, and within a month they had settled into a working arrangement that involved James showing Henry things and Henry being visibly impressed by James, which was a dynamic that served both of them. The shop on Clement Street continued to thrive. In 1881, Eudora expanded into the adjacent space, which had become available when the previous tenant moved to Wichita, adding a proper fitting room and a second work table and room for the new sewing machine she had finally purchased to Clara's great delight. She hired a second assistant, a quiet and meticulous young woman named Marta, and the three of them ran the expanded shop with a competence that was, by the early 1880s, something Harlan Creek pointed to as an example of what could be built from honest work and good judgment. George's partnership in the Halstead operation formalized into a partial ownership share in 1882, when old Harold Halstead began discussing the eventual future of the ranch with his wife Lucy, and determined that George Conroy was the person they wanted most to see it continue well. It was a significant moment, and he came home with it in his face before he said a word, that quality of contained gladness that she had come to know as his particular way of receiving good things. "Tell me," she said when she saw his face. He told her and she listened, and when he finished she came to him and took his face in her hands, not something she did often because she was not by nature given to demonstrative gestures, but this felt like a moment that needed it, and she looked at him. "You built this too," she said. 11 years of work and now this, you built it." He put his hands over hers where they held his face. "We both built," he said. "Different things," she said. "Alongside each other," he said. "As agreed. As agreed." She thought about the October evening outside her shop door when he had proposed adding his thread to what she had built, and the September afternoon in the bunkhouse office with the cake, and the morning she had walked 4 miles to the ranch to say yes, and the December wedding with Mabel crying in the first row. She thought about all of it, the full length of it from that first day with the measuring tape and the shirts. "Yes," she said. "As agreed." He kissed her then, with the warmth and certainty of a man who had been kissing the same woman for 4 years, and had never found any reason to be anything less than completely present for it. The years moved forward the way years do, not slowly and not quickly, but in the particular rhythm of a life being fully lived, with the days sometimes long, and the seasons sometimes swift, and the whole of it accumulating into something that, when looked at from any distance at all, revealed itself as extraordinary in its ordinary dimensions. James started school in 1882, at the small schoolhouse 2 streets from the shop, and applied himself to it with his characteristic tranquil determination, and came home each afternoon with reports of his day delivered in the complete sentences of a child who had been talked to as a person from the beginning. Henry started the year after, and was louder about everything, including school, which he found variously fascinating and aggravating depending on the day and the subject. Eudora watched them grow with the particular double vision of parenthood, seeing simultaneously the baby and the child and the person they were becoming. She brought them both to the shop when she could, not with any particular educational agenda, but simply because the shop was where she was and she liked having them near her. And over time, they both developed familiarity with the work that was not nothing. James had his mother's careful eye for color and fit, and Henry had a surprising talent for measuring things accurately, which perhaps reflected some deep structural interest in the physical world. George with his sons was one of the things she loved most in her daily life. He was with them the way he was with everything, patient and honest, and genuinely interested in what they thought and felt and found fascinating. He taught them to ride before they were 4. He taught James to read by a different method than the school used, which James seemed to prefer, and when she pointed out that this might conflict with the school's approach, he said he would ask James which method he wanted to use for which things and defer to him, which had the satisfying logic of all his best ideas. He taught Henry, at age 5, to identify cattle breeds by sight, which Henry found deeply satisfying, and which led to a period of several weeks during which Henry provided detailed breed identifications for every cow or ox or calf visible from any road or window, which was occasionally inconvenient and also entirely charming. Eudora Bailey, who was Eudora Conroy now in law and in daily life, though she kept Bailey on the shop sign, because it was the name the shop had been built under and she had thought about it, and decided it was right to keep it, was 33 years old in 1882, and the life she had was not something she could have fully described to the 24-year-old who had stepped off the train in Harlan Creek with $32 and a sewing box and a stubborn certainty. Not because it was so different from what she had wanted, but because it was more fully itself than she had known to want. She had imagined, in those early years, building something solid and independent and sufficient. She had built that. What she had not imagined, or had not known how to imagine, was the particular texture of a life that had both the thing she had built and someone to build alongside. The way the two of them together created something that was not subtraction but addition, not compromise but expansion. She thought about it on an evening in September of 1882, the boys in bed upstairs and the shop quiet below, and the two of them on the small bench outside the door in the last of the warm weather. George was reading, as he often did in the evenings, and she was mending something, as she often did, and the street was quiet and the air smelled like autumn coming and the sky was going dark in the west with the particular purple of a clear Kansas sunset. "George," she said. He said, not looking up immediately, "I want to tell you something." He put the paper down then and looked at her with the full attention that was one of his essential qualities. "I want to tell you," she said, "that you were right. About adding your thread, about alongside rather than over." She looked at the street. "I was afraid of that, not of you specifically, of the principle of it, of what it might cost." "I know," he said quietly. "It cost nothing," she said. "It only added." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You gave me a great deal more than you seem to account for in this telling." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the building and the business and the life you built before I came through that door," he said, "were the very things that made you the person I fell in love with. You had done the hard work of knowing yourself and building something true, and that was what I was asking to be part of. I was not rescuing anything. I was asking to be led into something very good." She looked at him. He looked back at her with that expression, steady and warm and entirely honest. "You are a good man," she said. "I am trying to be," he said. "You are succeeding," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him have it, the way she always did now, simply and without ceremony, which was its own form of ceremony. The years continued forward, and Harlan Creek grew as Kansas towns grew in the 1880s, more people arriving as the railroads expanded and the territory continued to be settled, more businesses on the main streets, more children in the school. The shop on Clement Street remained one of the central institutions of the town, the place women came for the things that mattered, the wedding dresses and the baptism clothes, and the alterations on beloved garments that had seen too many seasons to be replaced, and Eudora ran it with the same precise care she had always brought to it. She hired a third assistant in 1883 and began training young women not just to sew but to understand the business of sewing, the pricing and the client relationships and the mathematics of material costs, because she had a belief, grounded in her own history, that skill without the business knowledge to deploy, it was only half the foundation a woman needed. Clara Hobbs, who had been with her since before James was born, and who had grown from a capable assistant into a skilled seamstress and trusted colleague, was by this point running the shop's daily operations with an independence that pleased Eudora enormously. They had the relationship of women who have worked closely together long enough to have complete professional respect and genuine personal liking, which is a specific and valuable thing. James turned 6 in the summer of 1884 and had, by this point, his father's height in his future clearly written in the length of his limbs, and his father's patient quality of attention and his mother's eyes, dark brown and direct. Henry turned 4 and was all James was not, quick and loud and physically fearless, with a laugh that was disproportionately large for his size, and that made everyone in range feel the better for it. That autumn, Mabel Trent's husband died quietly, of a heart that had been failing slowly for 2 years, and Eudora found herself in the position of being the person who sat with Mabel in the evenings, and listened and made tea and was simply present, which was a thing she had not always been practiced at, but which she found she could do now in a way that the earlier, more armored version of herself might not have been capable of. Mabel had been one of the first people in Harlan Creek to treat her with simple warmth years ago, and being able to offer the same in return was something that mattered. "You are a good friend," Mabel told her on one of those evenings. "I have had good teachers," Eudora said, and meant it. George was elected to the Harlan Creek Town Council in 1884, which surprised him somewhat and did not surprise Eudora at all, because she had watched people in the town come to respect him in the way that quiet and honest competence eventually compels respect from anyone paying attention. He served without particular ambition for higher position, which she thought was appropriate, and brought to the council meetings the same deliberate good judgment he brought to everything else. In the spring of 1885 she discovered, rather to her own amusement, that she was expecting a third child. She sat with this for a day, which was shorter than the previous times, because she knew now what she was sitting with and how it felt and where it landed. It landed, as it had before, in gladness, large and warm. She told George, and he looked at her and said, "Again we are very fortunate," which was exactly the right thing and also very much him, and she laughed and agreed that they were. The third child was a girl, born in November of 1885, with the timing of a child who intended to be notable from the beginning. They named her Alina, which Eudora had carried in her mind as a name she loved without occasion to use, and Alina arrived with James's quiet eyes and Henry's large laugh, and absolutely her own entire personality immediately apparent, which delighted everyone in the building. James, at 7, received his sister with a seriousness that was entirely characteristic. He observed her carefully for a week, and then announced to his parents that she was interesting. Henry, at 5, was openly enthusiastic about the whole thing, and insisted on being present for every feeding and diaper change and other infant process, whether or not his presence was useful, which it usually was not but was always entertaining. George held Alina on the first evening, sitting in the chair by the window with the December dark outside and the fire warm, and Eudora watched him, this husband of hers, this man who had walked through her door with his hat in his hands 7 years ago, and asked to add his thread to what she had built, and thought about the full length of what had happened since. The Hooper business and the October evenings and the December wedding and James and Henry, and 4 years of partnership in the Halstead operation, and the expanded shop in Clara, and the training of young women and the council, and the ordinary extraordinary days. She thought about what he had said on the September evening, that he had not been rescuing anything, that he had been asking to be let into something very good. She thought about what she had known that morning with the frost on the windows, that she loved him, and how certain that had been, and how it had remained certain across every subsequent day without qualification or erosion. She thought about the $32 and the sewing box. She thought about the needle and the thread, and the way a piece of fabric became something wearable and structural through the careful application of skill and patience, stitch by stitch, hour by hour, in the direction of a shape you could see in your mind before it existed in the material world. She thought about the kind of love that was not rescue and not dependence, but the genuine addition of one person's particular thread to the pattern another person had begun, and how the resulting thing was different from what either of them had been or had separately, not because either was diminished, but because the combination was its own new thing. George looked up from Alina and found her watching him. "What are you thinking?" he said. "Everything," she said. "Nothing specific, all of it together." "That sounds like you," he said. "It is entirely me," she agreed. He smiled, the full smile she had first seen that October day on the bench, the one that made him look younger and entirely real. "Come here," he said. She crossed the room and sat beside him, and he shifted Alina carefully so she was between them, small and warm and entirely unconcerned with anything except being held. And outside the December dark of Harlan Creek, Kansas, settled around the building, and the fire gave its warmth to the room, and above the shop the sign read Bailey's dress shop in the painted letters that were her name and her work and entirely hers, and inside the life was full and present and shared and good. In the years that followed, the ones that stretched from the mid-1880s into the 1890s, Harlan Creek continued to grow and change, and the shop on Clement Street continued to be the thing Eudora Bailey Conroy had made it. A place of genuine craftsmanship, run by a woman who knew her own worth and communicated it quietly and completely through the quality of her work and the dignity of how she conducted her business. Clara Hobbs eventually opened a second shop in the next town with Eudora's full support and her direct assistance in establishing it, which was a thing Eudora was proud of in the way she was proud of all good things she had had a hand in. James grew into a young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's eye for detail, and a talent for figures that sent him, at 18, to study in Wichita with the intention of becoming a surveyor, which was the profession that seemed to him most fitted to the combination of precision and open country that he loved. Henry grew into a young man who worked the Halstead Ranch with the same enthusiasm he had brought to everything since infancy, and who had his father's gift with cattle and his mother's refusal to accept inadequate results from himself. Eleanor, who was Eleanor from the beginning and never anything else, grew into herself at her own pace and on her own terms, which her parents found entirely appropriate, and at the age of 5 she began systematically learning to sew in her mother's shop, not because she was pushed toward it, but because she had watched her mother's hands all her life and found the work genuinely interesting. By the time she was 10, she had an opinion about fabric selection that Clara Hobbs described as formidable. George and Eudora marked their 10th anniversary in December of 1888 quietly, the way they marked most things. Supper at the table with the children, the good candles, a bottle of wine that George had obtained from Millbridge for the occasion. She had made him a new shirt, the finest work she had done in years, because that was still the language she understood best, care expressed through making. He gave her a length of silk he had ordered from a catalog in Wichita, a deep green that matched the dress she had worn at the 4th of July dance a decade earlier when they had first danced, which meant he had remembered it and thought about it and tracked down the color, which was the kind of attention that undid her still. After the children were in bed they sat by the fire, the same chairs, the same ease of two people long familiar with each other and not made ordinary by it. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. We were strangers 10 years ago and 3 months. We were, he said. You did not look up when I came through the door. I was finishing a stitch, she said. I know, he said. I have always liked that about it. You were not waiting for anything, you were working. She looked at him in the firelight. And then you asked to be part of what I was working on. I asked very carefully, he said. You did, she said. You asked carefully and honestly and with patience, and you did not change those qualities after I said yes, which is the part that matters most. He looked at her, the hazel green eyes in the firelight, the face she knew as well as her own, the man who had come into her shop one June afternoon in 1878, and measured himself as a person worth knowing by the quality of his listening and the honesty of his asking. You gave me a life, he said quietly. I let you into a life, she said. You brought the rest. We built it, he said, together. Yes, she said, as agreed. She reached across and took his hand, and the fire burned low, and the sleeping house was full of the quiet that belongs to places where people are well and happy and at rest. And outside the Kansas night was cold and full of stars. The same enormous sky she had looked up at from the rail yard the day she arrived with $32 and a needle, and the stubbornness of someone who had already decided to build something real. And she had built it, and she had not been required to give any of it away. And there were people in the rooms above who were partly hers and partly his and entirely themselves. And the thread she had begun with was still the foundation and his had woven through it. Without obscuring a single stitch, she was entirely, completely, unreservedly all right. She was more than all right. She was, in the fullest and most precise sense of the word, home.